Right now, somewhere in your life, there's a small thing you took that you weren't completely sure was free. A grape at the grocery store, a pen off a hotel desk, Wi-Fi from a neighbor whose password you never actually asked for. It barely registers as theft, a nothing crime, a rounding error of the conscience. Now imagine you're a peasant in Edo-period Japan in the early 1700s, and you've just done the exact same thing. Palmed a single rice ball you told yourself you'd pay for later. Except in this version of the story, it isn't only your problem anymore. 4 other households, tied to yours by law, feel that guilt land on them within the hour. Because in feudal Japan, your neighbors weren't just watching, they were legally responsible for what you did. And what happened next depended entirely on how much you took, who you were, and who found out first. And the real answer is far stranger and far more communal than you get punished. Here's what most people assume about crime and punishment in feudal Japan. You did something wrong, officials caught you, you were punished according to the severity of the crime, and that was it. A fairly familiar individual accountability system, just with scarier-looking weapons. That's mostly wrong. First, theft wasn't primarily handled by professional police. For most of the Edo period, there was no dedicated police force patrolling neighborhoods the way you'd picture one. Crime prevention was outsourced to the neighbors themselves. Second, punishment for theft didn't scale the way you'd expect. Steal a small amount as a repeat offender, and you could be marked for life with a tattoo visible to everyone you ever met again. Steal a large amount once in the wrong domain, and the household elders might quietly settle it before it ever reached a magistrate. And third, the part almost nobody expects, the person who felt the weight of your theft first wasn't a judge. It was the 4 families who lived closest to you, who had signed their names to a document promising they'd answer for exactly this. So the real question isn't what happened if you got caught stealing. It's who exactly was doing the catching. And it turns out the person most likely to turn you in wasn't a stranger. It was someone who had everything to lose if they didn't. To understand what actually happened when you got caught stealing, you need to understand a system most people outside Japan have never heard of. The gonin-gumi, literally, the 5-person group. Starting in the early 1600s, the Tokugawa shogunate organized commoner households into clusters of roughly 5 neighboring families. This wasn't a social club, it was a legal unit. Every household in the group signed a document, agreeing to monitor each other's behavior and to answer collectively for crimes committed by any member. Historian Daniel Botsman describes the gonin-gumi system functioning less like a neighborhood watch and more like a distributed insurance policy the state took out against its own citizens, where the payout, if something went wrong, was paid in punishment rather than money. If someone in your group stole something, hit a criminal, or even just failed to pay taxes on time, the entire group could be fined, publicly shamed, or, in serious cases, punished alongside the offender. Failing to report a neighbor's crime, even one you had nothing to do with, was itself a crime, which meant everyone had a very direct, very personal incentive to know exactly what was happening in the houses next to theirs. Historian Herman Ooms, in his study of Tokugawa village life, describes gonin-gumi households essentially living inside each other's business by design, because the alternative was carrying someone else's punishment on your own back. It's the Edo period equivalent of a shared streaming account, where everyone gets locked out the moment one person tries something sketchy, except the consequence was a public fine, not a too many devices error. Here's the detail that changes how you picture this system entirely. It wasn't limited to peasants. Merchants had their own version, organized around shared shop fronts and guild ties instead of farmland. Even some temple communities operated under adapted collective responsibility structures. The five-family group was one small piece of a much larger philosophy running through Tokugawa law: that order was cheaper to maintain through mutual surveillance than through armies of officials. And the group didn't just react after a crime happened. It was expected to prevent one. Gonin-gumi meetings, held periodically to review each household's conduct, doubled as an early warning system. A family falling behind on rice payments, drinking heavily, or simply acting strangely was flagged to the group before anything criminal had actually occurred, because by the time a theft happened, it was already too late to avoid shared punishment. Which meant that long before you ever stood in front of a magistrate, you'd already been judged once by the people who lived closest to you, who had the most to lose, and who were legally required to care. Before we go any further, I want to know what you think. Do you think the gonin-gumi system kept Edo-period villages genuinely safer? Or did it just turn every neighbor into an informant with no other choice? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. The punishment ladder. Once your theft became known, whether reported by a shopkeeper, discovered on a magistrate's patrol, or turned in by your own gonin-gumi, the punishment that followed wasn't uniform. It ran on a ladder, and where you landed on it depended on the value of what you took, whether it was your first offense, and, quietly but decisively, what class you belonged to. Small, first-time theft usually meant a formal warning, sometimes combined with a public scolding delivered in front of the neighborhood. Humiliation as the primary tool, not confinement. Historian Anne Walthal's research on Tokugawa village governance describes local headmen using shame as a cheaper, faster substitute for formal punishment whenever possible, because a magistrate's court was slow, expensive, and drew unwanted attention to the whole village. Repeat theft escalated fast. Theft above a certain value, sources place the threshold around 10 ryo, a meaningful sum for most commoners, roughly a year's living expenses for a small household, could technically be punished by execution. In practice, magistrates had discretion, and most cases never reached that extreme. But the law on paper was written to be brutal specifically so the threat alone would do most of the enforcement work. And the latter wasn't measured only in money. What you stole mattered almost as much as how much it was worth. Rice, the closest thing the period had to currency you could eat, was treated more seriously than most household goods. Steal rice from a communal granary during a lean season, and you weren't just a thief, you were a threat to the whole village's survival, which moved your case up the ladder fast regardless of the actual quantity taken. The body as record. For theft that fell in the middle of that ladder, serious enough to punish, not severe enough to kill you for, the Tokugawa authorities had a solution that turned your own body into a permanent criminal record. Irezumi, literally inserted ink, was used as judicial tattooing, a mark, often a ring around the forearm or a specific symbol on the face, applied after conviction for theft. Each additional offense could add another line or ring. A three-time thief in some domains ended up with an unmistakable, escalating pattern that told anyone who looked exactly how many times you'd been caught. There was no removing it, no serving your time and starting fresh. The tattoo followed you into every future interaction, every attempt to find work, rent a room, or marry into a new family. You could pay your debt to the law and still spend the rest of your life paying it to everyone who saw your arm. The exact design wasn't standardized nationally either. It varied by domain. Some regions used a simple ring around the forearm. Others used a specific character or symbol tied to that domain's own penal code, which meant a well-traveled magistrate could sometimes look at a stranger's arm and know not just that he'd been convicted of theft, but where. which is where a word you've probably heard gets its actual origin. Yakuza, the word now associated with organized crime in Japan, comes from yakuza, 893, the worst possible losing hand in an old card game. It meant good for nothing. The men who ended up permanently marked as thieves, unable to reintegrate into ordinary society, often had nowhere left to go but toward each other. And the word for a useless hand of cards eventually became the word for the outsiders it created. The exception at the top. And if you were samurai rather than commoner, almost none of this applied to you. Samurai answered to a separate legal structure entirely, judged within their own domain, often permitted to resolve serious offenses through private, ritualized means, rather than public humiliation. Historian Constantine Vaporis, writing on Tokugawa status law, describes this as a system where the severity of a punishment often had less to do with the crime itself than with which legal category the person committing it belonged to on paper. A samurai caught stealing wasn't marked with ink in the town square. He was far more likely to be quietly stripped of rank, or in the most serious cases, allowed to end his own life with some dignity intact. A mercy never extended to the peasant whose name was never recorded at all. The theft was identical. The consequence depended entirely on the household you were born into. When the group paid. Here's the part of this system that almost never makes it into the popular image of feudal Japan. Theft didn't just cost the thief. Village records from the period document cases where an entire gonin-gumi was fined, publicly shamed, or made to perform labor because one member had stolen and the group had failed to report suspicious behavior in time. In one case documented by Botsman, a household outside Edo was found to have hidden a family member's repeated petty thefts from the rest of their 5-family group for months. And when it surfaced, in the 1790s, the other 4 households were fined jointly for concealment, not just the thief's own family. The logic was explicit. You were expected to know, and not knowing was treated as a choice. This is the detail that reframes everything. It wasn't just that your neighbors could catch you. The system was built so your neighbors had to catch you, because their own household safety depended on turning you in before someone else did. Compassion had a cost. Loyalty had a cost. And in a system like that, the fastest way to protect your own family was sometimes to report the family next door before they could hurt you first. Which meant that friendship inside a gonin-gumi carried a strange asterisk. You could genuinely like the family 2 doors down, share meals with them, help raise each other's children, and still be the person legally obligated to report them the moment their behavior put your own household at risk. Trust and surveillance weren't opposites in this system. They were the same relationship, viewed from 2 different angles. So, what actually happened if you got caught stealing in Edo, Japan? The honest answer is, it depended less on what you took and far more on who was standing around you when it happened. A first offense might cost you nothing but a public scolding. A repeat offense could mark your body for the rest of your life. A serious theft could, on paper, cost you your head, though in practice, most magistrates preferred a punishment that let you keep living inside a system that still needed your labor. And running underneath every one of those outcomes was the same structural reality. You were never just answering for yourself. 4 other households were standing behind you, and whether they protected you or reported you often decided your fate before a single official ever got involved. The next time you feel that flicker of relief when a mistake stays contained, when nobody else finds out, when it doesn't touch anyone but you, you're feeling something a peasant in feudal Japan almost never got to feel. In a gonin-gumi, there was no such thing as a private mistake. Everything you did belonged, legally, to the people around you, too. And that reframes something a lot of people carry without realizing it. The reason it feels unbearably heavy to disappoint people who depend on you, coworkers, family, a team, isn't some modern anxiety invented by open-plan offices and group chats. For centuries, in Edo, Japan, that exact feeling was written directly into law. Your mistakes were never just yours. Neither, really, are they now. You've just lost the paperwork that used to make it official. There's something almost generous buried inside a system that brutal. A gonin-gumi wasn't only built to punish you, it was also, on its better days, built to catch you before you fell too far. A family short on rice, a household drinking too much, a neighbor spiraling toward a theft they hadn't committed yet. The same structure that could turn on you was also, sometimes, the only thing standing between you and doing something you couldn't undo alone. So, next time you take something small and tell yourself it doesn't really count, remember that in a village outside Edo 300 years ago, that same tiny decision could have reached 4 other doorsteps before you'd even finished eating it. Nobody was ever really alone in that system. Not the thief, not the neighbors, not the family who signed their names promising to watch. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable part. Not the tattoo, not the fine, not the threat of the sword. It's how much they trusted each other to enforce a system built entirely on distrust. If you think living under someone else's watch was hard, wait until you find out what happened when something started hurting in the middle of the night, and there was no dentist, no painkiller, and nobody coming to help. You were never doing this alone. You still aren't.